but most of my career has been in the aftermarket, and the lion's share of that was a 12-year stint with Bosch and Vitronics on the diagnostic and tool side. Did every job imaginable at those companies, and the last 4 years I've been at Christian Brothers Automotive. My primary job of the 7 jobs that I do right now is I do store performance consulting. I have about 24 of our 115 stores that I'm a store coach for. And then myself and another guy who's here floating around somewhere today, we do technical support for our locations. We have about 550 technicians in our organization that use us for what I call level 1 triage before we go to an NFX or one of our other resources behind that. So we get a lot of tech support calls. We'll get probably in the neighborhood of 100, between the two of us, 100 tech support calls a week. So what I'm going to talk about is probably an observation from the last 2 years of tech support calls in the scheme of readiness. Now, Mark talked about, he had basically 4 questions that he'd given us. I figured in the interest of continuity, I took those 4 questions and kind of drilled them down into about 3 or 4 slides because they all kind of merged together, and an overview of service readiness from a franchise perspective and how we deal with our technicians. One of the things we talked, and one of his questions was specifically about if we were going to have requirements. And requirements coming from the engineering side, engineering group will always tell you I can't build something until you give me some specific requirements because I don't know what it is. This is one of those loaded questions in my view that says what are specific requirements for us to be service ready? So I'm going to paint this with a very broad brush at a very high level, and 3 things in particular that we don't do a very good job with before we even set requirements for service readiness in the aftermarket. Three major problems that would have to be accomplished. And the first one is the technician familiar with the scan tools used by the major OEMs? Aaron was just mentioning that there's a significant number of repairs that have to be used with the factory tool. I know Jim Von Air mentioned that in his presentation at Nissan. Is the technician at least familiar with what tool the OEM is using? And I'm not talking some of the more unusual OEMs, like what tool is Ferrari using? But we're talking things like, okay, if a General Motors product comes in the door, what tool would the GM dealer use? If a Toyota comes in, what tool is the Toyota dealer using? Because familiarity with what that tool is and how it operates, whether it's PC-based, whether it's embedded, is it cloud-based, is it local, those kind of things. Because when you follow that service tree, especially as we start navigating into OEM service information, the diagnostic routines are written around the factory scan tool. So you have to have an understanding of how the tool works in order to make sense of the trouble tree and the diagnostic. Is it subscription-based? Is it standalone? Can I go to Toyota's website, for example, and buy 2 days worth of access and use the factory tool? Or do I have to buy a year's subscription? So these are all part of the decision-making process in do I know what the OEM's using and how can I implement that in my business to be more successful? Does it connect with a J2534 device? I know there's still only a small percentage of shops that actually own a J2534 device, but we're seeing that movement gain some momentum in the last year and a half on connecting OEM software through a J2534 device so you don't end up buying 12 different pieces of hardware. Second, this gets to Aaron's point too about connectivity to service information. Does a technician have familiarity with navigation of the OEM service website? And even before the navigation piece, does he have a logon? Hyundai, Kia, Nissan, you can go out to those websites and register for free and have a username and password. So when that vehicle's sitting in the bay and you need to access the OEM service information, you buy service information for 24 hours, $20, not a big deal. Do I have all the stuff I need to get to the point where I put in my credit card, am I ready to go? Or do I spend a half an hour trying to create credentials? Because I have to wait for a response from the manufacturer or there's some other process involved. We're talking about things that kill productivity time. Familiarity with OEM training modules. And most of the guys on the OEM panel that we're talking about this alluded to this. They didn't necessarily dig real deep into it, but all of the OEMs have web-based service information training programs. Most of them have a prerequisite before you come to classroom training that you have to do the online stuff. Almost all that online training information is available on the manufacturer's website. Yes, you have to pay for it, talked about that earlier, but the reality is you can do all the same dealer level training for the most part that the dealer guys do, with the exception of maybe the classroom stuff, on their online portals, and it's all available. You just have to make the time to go out there, register yourself, figure out what the cost is, kind of pour through the offerings and figure out is there something available. So question number 3 was dealing with service readiness, and I think particularly on are there things that we're not really ready for. And I use the 70% rule. In addition to my career at Christian Brothers, I've probably been in thousands of shops over the last 15 years when I worked for Readiness and Bosch. Most of the shops I go into fall into that 70% category, which is they have the correct tool to always complete the repair probably 70% of the time. I know the OEM guys alluded to this. I know we're alluding to that on this panel. And that includes, do they have a scan tool that can properly perform the job? It's interesting to pull codes on a control module. It's certainly more interesting to be able to get some data stream, but if you follow the flow chart and you get to step number 24 and there's some recoding procedure, initialization procedure, setup procedure that you can't do with the tool you bought off the tool truck, none of that really matters. And so that 70% rule, if we're going to look at service readiness in the aftermarket, that number needs to be moved way up. I mean, we need to be, my rule of thumb is we need to be in the 90 or 95% service readiness business when it comes to tools and equipment. And along the same vein, we have a system level knowledge. Do they have the system level knowledge to diagnose the root cause? Jeff talked about this in his presentation about are we doing pattern failure diagnostics, or are we actually understanding how the system works, what the components do, all of the individuals, how they make up the big piece, and can we get down to a component level and figure out what's wrong with it? Do we have the knowledge to complete the repair? Probably one of the most common tech support calls that we get are related to immobilizer systems or ECU coding, programming, and initialization. A lot of the service information in the aftermarket is weak in that area, and I'm not in the locksmith business, but any domestic car, any Asian car from 2002 forward, if you replace a control module, an engine controller, you have to relearn the security system. If you ask the average technician, if you put an ECM in a 2004 Mazda, what's the procedure to get that thing started? Very few of them would be able to tell you that process. And so a significant percentage of the tech calls that we get are based entirely around, I got this thing all done and now the car won't start, what do I do? And so these are system level knowledge issues that we're not doing a very good job of educating on. Internally, I have a running joke with folks is what is the difference between practice and game day? Now in practice, you go through a lot of repetitious drills. I'm like the anti-sport for those of you who know me. I hate sports analogies, but we got passing, we got throwing, we got catching, all the fundamentals of the game. You have to learn to do all those fundamentals so when you get to game day, you don't look like a chump. If your team never practices and you don't know the fundamentals, if you go out there and you're competing against a team that does, you're going to get slaughtered. And so the analogy that we use internally is, and this is a rhetorical question that I ask internally for our own folks and you guys out there, what percentage really of the cars that come in are you practicing on? And I don't want an answer because I'd probably be embarrassed for a lot of us, but the reality is, and Jim Von Air talked about this, Bob Stewart talked about this, the dealers do a very good job, I think, of doing system level and model level preparation. We don't have that ability in the aftermarket because we work on so many different things. So my ideal, obviously, would be 100% of the vehicles that come in the aftermarket that we would be service ready for. I think that's completely unrealistic. I understand that. But I would like to be at the 80% range, which is 80% of the cars that come in, I at least have some system level knowledge. I mean, myself, probably half the support calls that I get, I have to say, hang on, let me call you back in 10 minutes, and I'm going to go into the service information and just start digging. I got to see from the start to the finish what's the process required to finish this repair so we don't start something and cause a bigger problem. Jim talked about labor pools. This is huge for us. Majority of the technicians that apply to us for technicians, even L1 master techs, are very good general mechanics but lack specific expertise. A lot of them are really poor just in basic Windows usage. 80% of what we do is now either on the internet or on a laptop or some usage of computers, and most of our guys just hate computers. And I don't know how we get them to like computers, but if they're going to be in the business in 5 years, they have to adopt this because this is where we're going. Flash programming is a big one for us. Network diagnostics, very few of the support calls that we get when it comes to network diagnostics do they know how to start that. I usually field those calls because of my background at Bosch and Vitronics. When we're building scan tools, you got to learn about networks and how they work. I use this slide from the Tech 2, no communication on the vehicle, because no communication on the scan tool causes heartache for a lot of technicians, because 90% of the world is I plug in my scan tool and it tells me what's wrong with the car. If the scan tool is not communicating with the network, they need to start much earlier in the process and figure out, do I have a scan tool problem or do I really have a problem with the car? I probably get 10 support calls a week just on my scan tool won't communicate with the car. How do I start diagnosing it? So these are system level problems. We need to do a much better job of explaining to technicians how these networks work so they can troubleshoot. And then obviously proper use of service information, and Aaron talked about that. Mark's question was, what percentage of shops are service ready? And I wanted to kind of clearly define that. The shop needs to understand whose responsibility is it to purchase scan tools. Many of the technicians that come to work for us that are L1 Master Techs don't own any scan tools whatsoever, which, as a guy who sold scan tools, I find that amazing. You would think that an L1 would at least own something off the tool truck. A large percentage of them expect the shop to buy their tools. And I don't want to start an argument about who's responsible for buying tools. What I'm saying is there needs to be a clear understanding between the owners of the shop and the technician whose responsibilities, who's buying what. Am I buying shop level tools, or are you buying some of the others? And I think we need to have that dialogue. Who's responsible for programming subscriptions? Who's responsible to keep these tools updated? You have a Chrysler Y-Tech, or you have the Ford IDS. They update those tools sometimes twice a week. Somebody in the shop needs to be the software champion and to manage their way through that, because what's really catastrophic to technician labor hours is he goes to connect his Ford IDS and there's an hour update, and he can't do anything until the tool finishes updating. So managing the software flow is important. And then a roadmap. Most technicians, I think, don't have a mentor at their location, whether it's the shop owner or the shop foreman, to help them figure out what things they're not good at, and then go out and actively, and I say actively, seek those resources, such as the OEM training modules or a vision event or things like that. To me, training is not just about spending 3 hours in the evening in a hotel room with a pizza by the local parts supplier. I mean, those are good things to gain some case studies, but real system level knowledge requires us to be much more proactive about going out and seeking stuff. This next one kills me when I go in a shop and they got a little bit of downtime and they're on the computer looking at motorcycles. Just nothing wrong with motorcycles, but they need to be using that downtime learning and not surfing. And then compensation, somebody mentioned flat rate earlier. I don't want to get off on that tangent, but the flat rate system has destroyed our industry. We need to figure out a better solution. I don't want to have that dialogue right now, but it's created a silver bullet mentality. And the silver bullet mentality has created an entire generation of technicians that don't know how to diagnose anything. And that's a big problem.